Welcome everyone, thank you for joining us. This is a joint webinar from the CoStar Network and the LGA Coastal SIG, and we're going to hear from three different presentations, all related to the iPACT project. So Robert Nicholls is going to give us an introduction to begin with, and then Dawn and Edelson are going to talk about coastal connections, and Toby Roberts about sustainable development. So we're looking forward to three different and interesting presentations, all related to iPACT. Just before we start those, I just wanted to remind everybody that the CoStar Network, that's short for the Coastal Communities and Seas Together for Resilience Network, which is an inclusive and collaborative community of practice. And what we're doing is working towards building knowledge and action for resilience for all UK coastal communities and seas. If you're interested in participating more and haven't done so already, you can join up via the website UK Coastal Resilience, or email us at costar@hull.ac.uk. And we're very pleased that today we're doing this webinar in conjunction with the LGA Coastal Special Interest Group. So they provide a collective voice for local authorities, again, looking at sustainable, resilient and thriving coastal communities. And you can see the link to their website there if you're interested. I'm very pleased that lots of members of the SIG have joined us today, and we were holding this webinar jointly because both of these groups were interested in hearing about the iPACT project. So we thought this was a good way to bring what iPACT is doing to a larger audience. So first presentation is going to be by Robert Nicholls from the University of East Anglia, and he's going to give us an introduction to infrastructure for ports, cities and coastal towns network. So that's iPACT. I'm going to stop sharing then and pass over the screen to Robert.
Okay, hello everybody. So I'm Robert Nicholls, and I'd like to introduce the Infrastructure and Port and Coastal Cities and Towns Network, or iPACT for short. So this is a UKRI funded, essentially EPSRC funded network. It was led by William Parry from Southampton, and the other members here, sort of Becky Lunn from Strathclyde, Leo Cruikshank from Lancaster, Yasna Mararotti from Queen's University Belfast, myself based in Norwich, Marie Harder from Brighton, and then Abubakar Bahaj from Southampton. So that's the group that's leading the network. And what is the sort of vision? What's iPACT about? Well, it's really about long-lasting, resilient transformations in port and coastal cities and towns. We sort of recognize three themes, I think, which resonate probably with some of the things that CoStar is addressing, really. First of all, the problems of the coast, that really the coastal areas tend to be more deprived socioeconomically than inland areas. Then there's the whole issue of climate change, both being resilient to climate change, but also in a low carbon way. So the whole agenda of net zero. So really we're looking at how can we look at affordable, sustainable and evidence-based, people-centric infrastructure systems that can really address these issues and transform us from 19th and 20th century infrastructure into infrastructure for the 21st century and beyond. And so around those themes, iPACT is creating a vibrant multidisciplinary research community that's looking at these issues. To give you a sense, where we had three main case study sites that we looked at, but then we were looking. We had other partners across the UK, as the map sort of shows. So if we start in the northwest of England, we had the sort of Lancaster and Morecambe area. Then moving around, we had the North Norfolk and East Anglian coastal area. And lastly, we were looking at sort of Southampton, the city of Southampton and the port of Southampton. So those are our sort of three major place-based areas of intervention. And in each one of those, we engaged with local authorities, and other interested stakeholders concerned with the coast. So you know, and we working with those local authorities, they help with providing sort of data engagement. What was important to the communities in these areas, and they practical things like meeting venues. UCRIC is a university network on infrastructure, and that actually again supported and supports the iPACT network. So to give you a bit more on the 3 study sites, so Morecambe is really a large town, a major seaside resort, and regenerating with things like Eden North. So there's a lot of deprivation, but there's lots of potential. Southampton, you have an international working port, one of the biggest ports in the UK. It's a waterfront city, but then ironically with almost no public waterfront because it's mainly in private hands. And there are issues around access to the water and the overall environment. That's sort of an overall issue. And then North Norfolk, it's a series of smaller seaside towns that have sort of experienced a decline due to the decline in tourism. And they're also on a soft and erosive coast. And so they're threatened by sea level rise and coastal erosion. And, government sea defences that have been there in the past may not be renewed. So there are lots of challenges and transformations, and like the Coastwise project is happening there, which many of you may well be aware of. Now, the funded part of the project is actually ended, but say that up front, but the network is, we've built a network and we're continuing, as these talks here today sort of demonstrate. So the overall, this sort of shows the timeline of the sort of funded part of the project. And the first thing was to really understand what people wanted, what people cared about in the coast. So Marie Harder was looking at using we value, which is a sort of technique to really go out and talk to different people in these 3 regions or sites to understand the different types of issues that emerged. And then we started to move to sort of understanding the kinds of things that might be of interest, and then having workshops where we look for project ideas that were consistent with these needs, and which we funded, and then we ran through a series of workshops up until the sort of the end of the funded project, which was January this year. But as I say, it's ongoing, and we're still continuing this work. So phase 1 was engagement and collaboration. So we had, what are the issues that are really at the heart of the community? We found, some things come out that are specifically coastal. Others emerge that are quite general, and you might well find in sort of inland communities as well. So there's quite a wide range of issues. Issues of access, I think, was one thing that seemed to come up a lot around in all the sites, really, in different ways. An issue of access. And then we moved on and we held workshops in each one of the sites. So the second phase, we held a workshop in Morecambe, and what emerged from there were 2 funded projects. One sort of looking at locally sourced materials for creating sort of coast protection, so community-based coast protection, and another looking at how we can take soft materials and make them harder and maybe help protect coastal assets, or maybe at least slow the erosion of cliffs. I don't think you stop it, but you can modify the properties of the coast. Then we moved on to North Norfolk, and we were looking at issues around coastal connection. There's a huge number of caravan parks in North Norfolk, and so that was one of the themes. There's a very large gas terminal, Bacton. And that, of course, is certainly talking about net zero. That's something that's not going to be happening, say, in 50 or 60 years' time, but it can be repurposed maybe for carbon storage and capture. So looking at what can this infrastructure be used for in the future, and then a more generic and science-based study looking at kind of coastal dynamics and understanding how biology can influence erosion. And our third workshop was in Southampton, and Dawn's going to actually be talking about that after me, so I'll say no more about that here. And then around these projects, we also had activity supporting the network. So we had lots of events and experiences with local authorities. We had sort of mentoring of the technical aspects of the work. We engaged with users and policymakers, and so I mean, I think Toby's work really is again not funded directly by iPACT, but has grown and reinforced by the iPACT network, and then sort of building a peer-led group for continuity beyond the grant period. So we know when we're sustaining iPACT and looking forward to what kinds of opportunities can emerge in the future in the space of infrastructure on the coast. We held 3 research funding sort of sandpits. We had a number of webinars and sort of visits. There was with the Southampton port, there was a city forum, and that's an event that's probably going to continue. So we're building strong links there with the port and discussing sort of infrastructure, and a similar event in our neighbouring city of Portsmouth. And we concluded the work. We concluded the funded part of the project by a showcase in January 2025, which maybe some of you on the call might have attended. So that's really just setting the scene there. So very, very brief. But really, I mean, with this network is really about trying to look at sort of long-lasting, resilient and sustainable infrastructure-led transformations in our port and coastal cities and towns. We have the website there at the bottom of this slide, which you can go to if you'd like to know more. And you're encouraged to join iPACT. And and obviously, we'd look forward to but if people have thoughts and ideas, we'd welcome input from anybody on the call or any thoughts that you might have after this webinar. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Robert. That was a really interesting sort of overview of what the project's about. So I'd encourage everybody, if you have any questions, you can put those in the Q&A section or in the chat. And maybe while that's happening, I could just ask you, Robert, what do you think was the most significant outcome? I mean, you're obviously past the sort of funded part of the project, but what do you think was the biggest outcome of the work that you did?
Well, I think probably the biggest outcome really actually all of the projects are delivering a really interesting results, and we're actually putting together a collection of papers for Anthropocene Coast that will sort of summarize both an overview of the network to date and the outcomes of these projects. But I would say the network itself actually, and really engaging and thinking about infrastructure and the coast, because I think there's quite a lot of coasts obviously recognized as a big problem, CoastR network, etc., in interest here today. And I think there's a lot of focus on the environment and a lot of focus on sort of people and the social dimensions. I think the infrastructure is really fundamental to underpinning that, and really trying to understand what is critical about infrastructure on the coast. And and for example, in North Norfolk, this technique for making for sort of essentially cementing soft materials, there's a lot of interest there, not in making protection, but just simply in delaying erosion. So it's about learning to live with erosion, new ways of thinking. Engineers used to stop erosion. Now it's more about living with erosion, and you need different kinds of infrastructure to do that. So that's one example of one of the things we've done. But I think the network as a whole, I think, is the major outcome, Stuart.
True. I think another interesting perspective is that you were saying issues of access came up with lots of people. I think that's something already as well that's maybe been identified in CoastR that people talk about. But you said it was a range of access issues. Could you say a little bit more about that? Was something
Well, I think, well, in North Norfolk, a lot of it is about really the absence of public transport. So, as I say, some of the issues you could see as probably being generic. You could go to the middle of England and probably find that people might say the same kinds of things if you went to the right place. But I mean, access. I mean, the Southampton case is a place where it's very coastal in that basically the port own all the waterfront virtually, and so in Southampton you can live there and yet not feel that you're in a coastal city. And there are places you can access the water, but they're rather limited. And so I think from the point of view of thinking forward for the city, really improving access, I think, is quite an important part of development, both economically and socially, and for the well-being of the people. So I think that's quite a common issue in ports, because obviously ports occupy a large footprint of land and it has to be on the coast. So that is a generic issue that I think you see in other parts of the UK and in fact globally.
That's great. Thank you. It's really good. I think what we'll do now is we'll move on to the next presentation. So we're now going to hear from one of those example projects. We're now going to hear from Dawn and from Edelson from the University of Southampton talking about coastal connections. So I shall stop sharing my slide there and let you.
Hopefully you can see the slides, but before I move on, I want to completely agree with Robert that it was the network. I always feel like an imposter because my area of expertise is health inequalities and the impact on environment on health inequalities. So coming to this space, I didn't know Edelson, and now we're doing lots of work together, and it's a joy actually to be talking to not only interdisciplinary but transdisciplinary. Our paths would never have crossed, and I always find work like that really stimulating. So that to me was the most important thing. So the aim of our little iPACT project was to develop an innovative model which removes physical and societal barriers in employing green and blue spaces to ensure that all people are independent and equal in society to support decision making. We had a number of objectives. We had conceptual, which Edelson will talk about, identify community organisation research-led questions relating to green and blue spaces, methodological, a community research group will be established, informing the ensuing project, knowledge exchange and policy for building knowledge equity into a larger project. So that's what we set out to do in our short 10-month project. So I'll hand over to Edelson now. So Edelson, if you want to just tell me when to move on.
All right. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So yeah, we met in the workshop, and one of the things about Southampton is that it has amazing green areas, lots of green areas, but people drive to the green areas, stay there for a while, and drive back, which is sort of counterintuitive to the idea of active transportation and what green areas should entail. And one of the things we were particularly interested is in cycling to these spaces, which would be nice, for example, to have a cycling network that connects all green spaces. And then we try to look at the cycling network in Southampton. So in the left, you see part of the cycling network, and you can see the bus in there, and that the infrastructure is just some painting in the street. And then you can see the other one, which is even worse. You can see that it's in the pavement, and then a zoom below in the right-hand corner, you'll see that there are bus stops, traffic signs, and all that. And expecting people to go and cycle into all that. And you wonder why people don't take up cycling. Right? So please, next one. The idea was to try and explore then why people don't take up cycling, but not just as people tend to do, like looking at what are the factors and build a regression or something like that, but trying to understand actually the factors that are usually taken up are indirect. Actually, you don't cycle because there's no infrastructure. And then there's no infrastructure because of other issues. Right? So the map you see in there is the cycling network around the city center of Southampton. You'll notice that it's not connected, has like pieces of 1-2 blocks, which perhaps was easier to build, and then you say you have this many kilometers of cycle path in the city, but actually it's not very useful. So what we imagined was the blue things in there. So if we were to plan the next wave of cycling infrastructure, how should we do it? We propose we do it as in the blue dot, trying to connect what's in there already. Right? But when you're doing that, of course, there are a few considerations. Cost, first one. But then our objective should be connectivity instead of just having this many kilometers of cycling network, but that the cycling network should be connected. And then the other bit that's related to the first picture, safety, which we call quietness or the literature call quietness, which is like, is this safe enough for you to send my child into school, for example? Or if I am not very proficient, can I cycle in this network? Will I feel safe? And the other bit is equity, which probably Dom's going to talk more later on. But then for equity, we use the index of multiple deprivation. So connectivity is sort of clear what the output would be. Cost, money. Safety, we defined as having proper segregated cycle paths, or when you go into the street, having a street that's like in a residential area is better, right, than a very large avenue. Next one, please. So this is the map of the whole of Southampton. And then you can see there the disconnected bits that I zoomed in the city center. And you have to take this a bit with a grain of salt, because most of this infrastructure that's shown in the map, this is open street maps, is actually on the pavement. Right? So some of them are good things, like the one linking the city center to the large green area in the left. But the other ones not necessarily are good pieces of infrastructure. But the idea was, starting from a map such as this one, how can we build new infrastructure in a way that we connect the green spaces, the blue spaces, together, right? With it paying the least amount of money possible. Okay, so please, next one. So those are sort of solutions that you will get in the left side. You'll see a cost versus coverage. So coverage is how connected it is, how much of the city is covered, and then cost, and of course, cost goes up as you increase coverage. And then in the right-hand side, you'll see that there are a number of curves in there with 1, 2, 3, 4. And those are when we are considering the cost increase of having one more connection to a green space or blue space or an existing infrastructure, 2, 3, and 4. Right? And then you can see that the connectivity nowadays is very poor, it's around 20%. But then once you increase the connectivity, the cost tends to decrease. And then it will stabilize when you reach around 60% of coverage. the thing that's interesting is that around 30% you have you go up. And why you go up? It's because then you already connected everything that there is, and then you need to go farther away to improve your network. So that's the overall idea. Next one, please. Yeah, and then you can see, not very clearly, unfortunately, but the yellow bit, if you really squint and you see the yellow bit, this would be the proposed network that we would design to connect the existing green and blue space. And you can see that as opposed to current planning, that they tend to plan one origin and one destination, this planning would be, no, we have this piece of money and we want to improve the existing infrastructure and get it more connected. And then you can see that you spread around and you can access most green spaces, or nearly all green spaces in Southampton with the overall idea. Next one, please.
I think it's me now.
Yeah, now it's you.
Okay, thanks, Edelson. So my little work package synergy was to ensure that the voices of our marginalised residents are heard throughout the project. So the method we used was we had a discussion group with community organisations such as charities or religious establishments to gather perspectives of the project and co-produce a recruitment strategy. We also did interviews with community residents, focusing on the barriers, facilitators and perspectives of living in a coastal community and utilising the green grid and green and blue spaces. So the results of this piece of work then, we did 1 workshop, 2 focus groups and 12 interviews. And there's some pictures here. There I am stood by the monitor, but Edelson sat there in the background as well. So we had quite a good turnout and we gathered lots and lots of different pieces of data. We kept them working. They had a free lunch, so we got the data from them. And from this, there were certain themes that appeared, and the italics are quotes. So the parks, I find, those are a bit like the green lungs of the city. And the barriers, accessibility. One of the major issues across almost all of the green spaces is that there are no toilet facilities. If you've got young children out for a day, inclusivity, lack of seats on parks or muddy paths are a concern for those with mobility issues. This quote, in the play park, they've got a lot of those barky, chippy things, but even there was a couple of bits of equipment that had that rubberized flooring that would be suitable for a wheelchair user. That would be great. And this concurs with what Robert mentioned earlier, coastal privatisation of much of the waterside. I feel like I'm in a town that's turned its back to the sea. There's a difference in knowing we live there and feeling like we live there. They also helped us draft some possible solutions we could explore in future grants. To help overcome personal accessibility barriers, decisions whether you should go to a green or blue space is made well before you actually get there. So the information provided on it is important. Things like a phone app, which could show you exactly where what the end of the path looks like. So maybe a little photo. And better maps to be able to confidently explore larger urban green spaces. Maybe they could have a map and say a QR code you could scan, and the map can be on your phone. And in particular for neurodiverse people, having information about accessibility, what the place is like, etc., is very useful. Things like video walkthroughs and pictures can help. And a lot of this was based on the fact that some of the people giving us data had mobility issues or disabilities. And one of the comments I remember was this wheelchair user was going through a park on a path and got to the end, and then there was that, you know, the locked barriers to stop cars going on it, and she had to turn around because she couldn't get under. And I thought, I never even thought about that. And this is the joy of getting information from people in our communities. So there's our email on the slide. So what I'll do is I'll stop sharing, and I can answer any questions, and Edelson can answer questions also.
That's great. Thank you very much for your presentation from both Edelson and Dawn. That was really interesting. We've got a question here. It's a little bit longer from Great Yarmouth. So Great Yarmouth has patches of weak coastline that coastal assets apparently don't justify action on the current formula. The question here is partly about, is there any new money involved with iPACT that could help with some of these problems? So I suppose that's maybe, obviously iPACT itself doesn't have problems, but maybe Dawn and Edelson, you could talk about whether perhaps from your project there are any opportunities to sort of follow on with you're obviously looking at, you know, what the issues were. Do you think there is any opportunity that doing these type of studies like what you were doing would gain some funding to make some changes?
There is so much out there. I think Edelson will concur. I'm health, so my area of funding is usually National Institute for Health Research. And there is just so much coming out about climate change, coastal communities. In fact, there's one commission out regarding coastal communities at the moment, and I'll put the link in the chat if anyone's interested. But there is just so much coming out, just relentless. I know that's for research, which may not pay for services per se, but there is so much interest from NERC, from health, all about health, because people recognise now the holistic approach to medicine. Accessing green and blue spaces is good for your health. And ultimately, communities, coastal communities, and they're in people with transient communities, for example, in coastal communities, all of that feeds into health, and ultimately we're all people. There's a huge amount of interest in this area, and I'll put the link. I don't know if you want to add anything, Edelson.
No, I think yeah, you were right. There's loads of funding regarding health and regarding global climate change and all the connections. But yeah, it's also a crowded environment, right? It's not nowadays lots of people trying to apply for these fundings as well. And as for like specific funding, unfortunately, we were talking to people in the councils around here, and what they tell us is that even though there is some funding for like active transportations and the like, it's but just a very small fraction of what the infrastructure budget is for car-related things. Which means that even though on paper those things are priority, in real life we still have a ways to go, I think.
Yeah, so there's another interesting comment about a project called Essex Pedal Power, and talking about how tracks were used to remove barriers. was wondering, obviously in your project, you were looking at connecting together the green-blue spaces, but did you look at all at how that made other sort of community resources more accessible to people, or was it just focused on the green-blue space?
No, so in our model, we treated a green and blue space as every network that was connected to it. So if there is a cycle lane from one green space up to a neighborhood, then we treated everything as a green space. So you could, so we were modeling access to infrastructure as well. And the idea being that nowadays cycling is much, the planning is just concerned with people going to work, when this is just one thing that you do in your life, and you should be able to go to the supermarket, visit your friends, and go anywhere as you can go in a car, right? So the planning was with this idea that, yeah, as you are free to move in with your car, you should be free to move with your bike without having to concern yourself with being alive at the end of it.
Yeah. All right, that's great. Well, I think we'll move on to the next presentation. So Toby Roberts is going to be talking to us about sustainable development in port cities. So I will stop sharing my screen and Toby will.
Okay, so yeah, as already been mentioned, I'm going to talk about sustainable development in port cities. And basically, I'm going to introduce 3 different projects that I've been involved with. The first of these was my PhD research, which was a 4-year project funded by the EPSRC and the engineering consultancy Ramble. So this was trying to identify global guidance for sustainable development in port cities. It was quite general, just trying to identify areas of agreement or disagreement. The second of these is the EU-funded Emerge project, which looked at the environmental impacts of shipping emissions. So this particularly focused on the use of scrubbers to reduce sulfur pollution. So basically washing the exhaust gas through seawater and then releasing it back into the sea. So obviously that's got implications for sustainability. And then finally, the iPACT project, which has helped take some of this work to the next stage. So just as some background, which I'm sure a lot of people will be very familiar with, but it just helps set the scene. So historically, there's a very strong link between ports and cities, and this, the close proximity between the two has been very beneficial. And the port has had a lot of positive impacts on the city in terms of culture and identity, and also some negative impacts, things like crime and lawlessness and so on. But as the ports have grown, they're often now locked into these central locations. And at the same time, the benefits that ports make have become increasingly spread. So it's an interesting problem for sustainability, because the local people have to suffer all of these negative impacts whilst not necessarily experiencing any extra benefits. So modern ports are a major source of environmental pollution, air pollution, noise pollution, traffic congestion, water pollution, and so on. They're also a source of visual blight, community severance, and have a severe impact on local people. And in major port cities, the port often makes up a significant percentage of air emissions. So in Hong Kong, I think the port makes up over 50% of SO2 emissions, for example. So whilst these negative environmental impacts are very localized, at the same time, the economic benefits have become increasingly spread away from the port, with up to 90% now occurring outside the port area, according to the OECD. So despite ports being essential to the economy, the local people don't necessarily benefit any more than someone else who lives further inland. And ports also provide considerably less local employment than they would have done in the past. So this historically strong relationship between the port and the city has been broken, and the city has lost its connection to the benefits the port provide, while still experiencing the negative impacts. And this process has been called demaritimization, which I hate saying, but once I've got it out the way, it's fine. And this has been accompanied by a decline in local support for ports from residents. But despite all of these negatives, port cities are also ideally placed to lead the transition to a more sustainable world. They're places that are full of resources, waste products, potential consumers, industry, have considerable potential for things like renewable energy and offshore wind. And they're also essential because 68% of the world's population will live in cities by 2050, and coastal areas have the fastest rates of growth. So realistically, if sustainability is to be achieved, it has to be done in port cities. Otherwise, it won't achieve what it wants to. And ports are also increasingly recognizing that they do need to improve relationships with local communities and work towards what is called the societal license to operate. So the European Seaports Organization has placed improving relationship with local communities in its top 10 priorities. And the societal license to operate is essentially fulfilling the expectations and needs of shareholders and local communities in a way that goes beyond the creation of wealth. So the first of these projects was my PhD research, which was a global study of port and city authorities. So it's port authorities in 26 different countries and city authorities in 13 different countries. So some countries did have more than one port city. So the British Ports Association shared my survey with all of their members. So there was quite a large UK component, but also the USA and China responded very well. And this aimed to basically identify areas of alignment and tension, focusing on social, economic, and environmental issues. And I tried to condense this into 5 key areas that came out very strongly. So the first of these was that there's a real lack of cooperation between ports and cities. And quite often they have very similar targets and they want to work towards the same things, but they just don't cooperate. And before I started, there was a bit of an expectation that maybe the cities are interested in sustainability, but the ports are just commercially focused and they're not interested. But for me, the problem that I came across was the ports were interested. The cities just didn't have someone whose job it was to deal with the port quite often. And they just saw it as something totally separate. And they were quite happy to engage with me, but they would pass the questionnaire around trying to find someone who had the expertise, and eventually a lot of them wouldn't find anyone. So I think addressing that is one of the most important aspects in improving sustainability in port cities. And I think maybe also highlights a role for third-party organizations to act as a neutral mediator to bring these together, because one issue the ports did raise is they don't like the city interfering and telling them what to do and blaming them for things that they feel they're not responsible for. Another area came out very strongly is that both ports and cities were interested in the circular economy, and they reported it having similar financial barriers to other things they're interested in. So it's not necessarily the main problem, but the main problem they did highlight was, again, a lack of leadership, a lack of networking, lack of information. So again, there's an opportunity just by bringing the stakeholders together to make progress in this area. Another thing that came up for both was the desire to increase renewable energy. So ports were very interested in diversifying the range of services, and renewable energy has been used as one way to do that. And a lot of the time, the city authority also has a desire to improve renewable energy. So again, it seems like there's potential to make significant improvements just by getting the stakeholders to cooperate together. And then again, a lot of these things are not surprising, but what's surprising is that they don't work together. So things like electric port equipment, building efficiency improvements, short ship power, all came out as very popular, but they just don't work together and they can't overcome the financial barriers. So a good example is the shorter-ship power system in Southampton, which they only managed to build by getting money from the local business community. So it just shows the role of stakeholders in helping ports and cities address these things. The Emerge project, which I mentioned briefly at the beginning, also found that some technologies like open loop scrubbers, which discharge polluted wash water back into the ocean, potentially have catastrophic impacts on the marine environment and should probably be banned. So it's important that we don't try to embrace technologies that just prolong the status quo and create other impacts that maybe weren't anticipated, and should be proactive in pursuing greener and cleaner fuels. And another issue was the social aspect, which is often neglected in a lot of these studies. And I found that ports that had access to the port area, access to the sea, and maritime museums had the port perceived they had a better relationship with local residents. Whether they actually do or not is obviously a different question, but I think that's interesting because it feeds into some of the findings from iPACT, which I'll discuss in a moment. Another interesting finding was that you might anticipate the largest port cities would have the biggest problems. But what I actually found was that there's a category of city which is between 100,000 and 1 million people, and then also a category of port. So we combined cargo and passengers onto one axis by comparing how much of either 1 ton of ship could move, so that we can compare the two. And this category of medium port, again, has the lowest levels of adoption of pollution mitigation, has the poorest relationship between stakeholders, and the lowest levels of cooperation. And that's interesting because this category here is the category that Southampton is in, which takes us on to Southampton as a case study. So Southampton's a medium port city, has a privatized port, and it does have a long history as a port, even if the main port area now is built on reclaimed land from the 1930s. So it's the UK's largest cruise port, and I think the second largest container port, but it's no longer one of the largest employers in the city, and a lot of the jobs it creates are spread away from Southampton. So 11,000 jobs in the automotive industry in the West Midlands, for example. So the challenges of Southampton is, as we've discussed earlier, it's surrounded by blue space on all sides, so the 2 rivers and then Southampton Water, but there's a lack of publicly accessible waterfront, and the port obviously creates pollution and traffic issues. So most people's opinion of the port now is that it's something they don't really have any connection to. It's just sort of over there, and there's a big security fence and you can't go in. So that leads me to the iPACT project. So the Port City Forum essentially tried to address this by bringing some of the stakeholders together. And it was quite well attended by Southampton City Council, Associated British Ports, DP World, which is the container port operator, Southampton Voluntary Services, and so on. And all of the attendees felt the event was useful and they would like to continue meeting. And there were some outputs of this. So we had some student group design projects, which have recently been finished. The university also contributed to a citywide nature festival called Urban Wild. So we focused on the blue space and maritime heritage aspect. And I've also heard that ABP have also done a few talks with the local community following on from this event. And another interesting source of data from the iPACT project is the We Value workshops, which were mentioned earlier. So this basically brings people together who have a shared identity and tries to identify what it is they want their city to be like, what it is they need in the local area, and identify common shared values, which came up with this results, which I think highlights a few things that are very interesting. So the first of these is there's the residents really identify a need to have access to the sea and also have infrastructure to prevent flooding. And obviously those two things don't necessarily go hand in hand, and quite often coastal defences will cut off access to the sea. So there's an opportunity to develop multi-use sea defences with maybe cycle paths or walkways. And I think this is something that maybe the port could consider as a way to improve its local support. There's also a desire for new industry for economic development and job opportunities, which again supports the idea of embracing the circular economy or renewable energy. There's also a desire for green areas and resilience to extreme heat. So again, this supports the work that Dawn and Edison have talked about, and the benefits of having these green spaces in the city. And another thing which came out is that the local residents also want to have a say in decision making, which hopefully things like the Port City Forum can help bring some community groups. And I also think that if ports want to improve local attitudes and work towards the societal license to operate, this type of approach might be the way they could sort of operationalize that and really identify what boxes do they need to tick to improve local support. So the combined conclusions of all of these projects, I think, are broadly similar, which is there's a need to improve cooperation between stakeholders. There's the potential to adopt green technologies and the circular economy. There's importance in reducing pollution, and there's significant social benefits to be gained from improving things like coastal access and green spaces. So there's my email address if anyone has any questions, which we don't have time for today. But yeah, anyone have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
That's great. Thank you, Toby, for your presentation. And yes, please feel free to ask questions. I was just wondering, from what you said earlier, and the studies that you looked at, it's interesting, you were looking at international examples of ports and cities. Did you find, in looking internationally, any particularly good examples of where ports and cities sort of worked well together, sort of exemplars that perhaps we could follow or learn from?
I think there's different examples for different things. So there's a place in Denmark called Kalundborg. I don't know if it's pronounced correctly or not, but in terms of the circular economy, they've got this huge industrial symbiosis thing with all these businesses exchange their waste products. And it's already much more advanced than anything we have in somewhere like Southampton. And then places like Rotterdam also have a lot of reuse of some of the waste of the port. So the heat from the ships is used in greenhouses, I think, and CO2 and so on. So I think really Southampton seems to be, it's got a lot of catching up to do compared to some other places.
Do you think there is a willingness on that? Because it's obviously, as you said, it's a privately owned port. Is there a willingness for them to become more engaged and
I think
improve their relationship?
I think there is. So when I very first started this research, everyone would always say, "Oh, the port won't be interested. They won't touch that." I've always found that actually they are interested, and obviously people might say, "Oh, well, it's greenwashing. They're not actually going to do anything about it." But I am also now involved in a project with Southampton Business School, where they've partnered with the port operator DP World to come up with a system to incentivize electric vehicles into the port, and then potentially reinvest the revenue that booking system would create into the transition to net zero. So I think there's still, and maybe they still need some convincing to focus on some of the wider social and environmental things, but I think they are going in the right direction, I think.
Great, thank you very much. There haven't been any more questions come up in the chat just at the moment, but I'd like to thank the four speakers, sorry, Robert, Dawn, Edelson and Toby for some really interesting talks telling us a lot more about the iPACT project itself and some of the specific work that you've been doing in different places. Really interesting to hear, and thank you for sharing that with us today. Everybody on the call has got your contact details, so if there's other things people would like to follow up on, please feel free to do that. There's also some comments and other parts in the chat if people want to read and look at that, some links to some other projects and other bits of work that might be useful to people. So once again, thank you very much to all the presenters today. Really interesting set of presentations. And I'll just plug the next webinar before I finish here. So the next webinar will be on Tuesday, the 15th of July. Notice I've put it in bold there, it's on a Tuesday rather than a Wednesday for the next one, between 2 and 3 p.m. Where we'll be hearing from the Crafting the Shore project, which again had a link into iPACT here, and also hear more about the sustainable management of UK Marine Resources Programme, which will be presented by David Patterson and Mark James from the University of St Andrews, and it's Suzanne Illich and Serena Pilastri from the University of Lancaster talking about Crafting the Shore. So please sign up to join us. You'll be able to sign up for the webinar by following the links on the website, and also we'll be mailing out to you after this event an easy link for you to join up to the webinar next time. And there'll also be a recording available. So there is a YouTube channel that has the recordings available for all the webinars. So we'll ensure that you get the link to that. So once again, thank you to everybody for coming to join us. And I hope to see you in about a month's time for the next webinar. Thank you.